Hey everyone, welcome to the stream. Trying a little bit different thing here today. I'm not at my usual high bandwidth location, so apologies if there are any technical hiccups. I won't be showing my face uh, in an effort to minimize the amount of upload bandwidth I'm using here. But let's get started. Today, I'm going to be talking about a pretty short and sweet example of using arbitrary SQL dialects in a somewhat unique feature of Ibis, which is the ability to run SQL queries against an Ibis expression. And this, Ibis didn't invent this in any way. This exists in other data frame APIs like Polars and PySpark, I think, might have been one of the first to do this. So it's not super new. The novelty in Ibis is that you can run, all the SQL backends that we implement. So we've sort of made it work with all of them. And so additionally, the new feature that it's still in a pull request, but it's up and coming, is that you can pass the dialect of, say, MySQL to DuckDB, even though those SQL dialects look very different. And I'll show an example here. Let's import the interactive stuff. Again, if you haven't seen my video on interactive on Ibis Interactive, what this does is just bring in a few conveniences, like this alias to the examples module EX, and so now we can tab complete all of our examples. And what I usually use is penguins, because everybody loves penguins. So I'm going to assign that to a table. And by default, we're running with the DuckDB backend, so everything's going to be pretty snappy. It's also a SQL backend, which makes it really easy to show off kind of what we're doing here. So let's just play with .SQL here for a bit. So .SQL is a method that takes in a SQL string and a dialect. We'll see that in a second. It takes in a SQL string and it gives you back an opaque expression with the column names and types, a table expression in Ibis. So something that's not super useful, but that is totally possible, is that you can just select from your existing table. Now, I don't actually know what the table name of this thing is, so let's see if we can just rename that to something useful. Cool. So let's go back to .SQL and we'll say select star from penguins. And hopefully we should just see the output that we got before. Great. Now if we just go scroll back up and see what we did, everything looks basically the same. And this can accept arbitrary SQL, right? So you can say, this is useful if you're coming from a situation where you've got a huge pile of SQL, you don't have time or desire to rewrite everything to Ibis, but you want a nice Pythonic API for doing your work. So, it accepts arbitrary SQL. So you can write average, I don't know, let's say bill length as BL, average BL MM. And it looks like I misspelled something, species, maybe. Okay, is it capitalized? Wow, that's a lot of traceback. Let's just look at T again. What am I doing wrong? Species, described, select species. Oh, trying to aggregate without a group by. That is not smart. Cool. So we got what we wanted. Now, the new feature that I've worked on allows you to pass a second argument called dialect, which by default is none. And what that means is it will use the dialect of whatever backend your table is tied to. If your table isn't tied to a backend, then it's not going to work, and you'll get an error message about that. Um, but and so basically, without passing dialect, it's as if you passed dialect equals DuckDB. Cool. So it kind of looks like that. Now, what if we passed some dialect that's like we know to be different from DuckDB? So it wouldn't be such an interesting example to be like, okay, we'll show the Postgres dialect because like we actually this query would be exactly the same in Postgres. Um, but let's say we had actually let's relabel um, the species column to be let's say let's give it a capital just to throw in some confusion. Okay, now let's look at our columns property. Oop, columns. We've got species with a capital S. And so we can run this query again with DuckDB. DuckDB seems to not really care here. It's because we're selecting from penguins. Um, let's actually give our new T a new alias, and we'll call it cap penguins. Capitalize penguins. I'm gonna I'm gonna run the same SQL query again. .SQL select species, the capital S. And now I have to quote this average bill length You can see SQL's bit verbose here. BLM from cat penguins group by. I'm just gonna say 1 because I'm lazy. And we got our capital species. The thing to note here is that .alias will introduce a new name for whatever table expression you're calling that on. So in this case, it's T, and it's the T with the capital S species, and I've given that a name, cat penguins. Now, what if I had sort of a similar query, but I was coming from MySQL, which has backticks for quotes, right? Now, if I pass this to DuckDB, if I just say dialect, or I just leave the dialect alone, I'm going to get an error because DuckDB is like, what the heck are you talking about? I don't know anything about backticks. It's giving me some error message from the database that it's asking me if I meant exclamation double underscore postfix. No, I definitely did not mean that, but that's fine. DuckDB has a reasonable implementation of a SQL parser. Luckily, there's a really sweet library out there called SQLglot, maintained by Toby Mao, and that library has done great things for us in Ibis. It allows us to generate SQL. In some cases, we're using it definitely for the transpilation capabilities, and it gives pretty nice parse error messages when things start to fail. So I can just tell Ibis like, hey, interpret this string as MySQL, and boom, we've got we've just run like basically a MySQL query on top of DuckDB. It sounds a little weird, but this can be really useful if you're say coming from, I don't know, Snowflake, or you're coming from BigQuery and you're moving to another system. You can actually leverage Ibis here. You can get your Python and you can have your existing SQL still work by throwing it into this .SQL method and telling Ibis like what the dialect is. So if you wanted to go from MySQL to DuckDB, or DuckDB to Snowflake, or Snowflake to DuckDB, or whatever direction you kind of want to go in, Ibis is there to kind of support you with .SQL. And so that is it for today. I hope the stream doesn't sound terrible. Thanks for joining in. Please subscribe, please like, comment,